see. I chose to do my research on the effect of the California gold rush on the Native American population. I've had some background knowledge. I knew a couple miners and settlers had justified the killing of Indian with false propaganda of Indian raids, calling them savages, etc. However, I wanted to know the real story. So my thesis is this. Was the California gold rush California's powerful entrance as a state into the U.S., or was it a bloody genocide of the indigenous people? To better understand the situation the Indians faced, we must go back to the mid-1700s, before the Spaniards colonized modern-day California. The Native American population thrived. Over 100 tribes, made up of roughly 300,000 indigenous people, lived throughout California. These 300,000 made up of nearly one-third of Indians in the U.S. The indigenous people were mostly hunter-gatherers, but also practiced a couple forms of primeval agriculture, such as forest gardening, a low-maintenance food production method involving mostly fruits and nuts. They also used small-scale, easily managed forest fires to prevent forest fires locally. Also, Indians were known for fire stick farming, the practice of burning forested areas in order to bring in more grasslands, and with it, more grass-eating animals. So, in order to figure out if we can classify this as a genocide, we need to know the true definition of genocide. So, the United Nations met in New York on December 9th, 1948, at the International Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. At this convention, the United Nations definition of genocide was set. According to General Assembly Resolution 260A-3, Article 2, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And or E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So in order to fully understand the crisis the Indians finally found themselves facing, we must jump back to nearly 100 years, back to 1769. The Spaniards were the first to colonize California, and in 1769, the mission San Diego del Alcala was the first of 21 Spanish missions constructed. Military intimidation, bribes, and the onslaught of European diseases forced natives into the mission system. At missions, children and parents were separated, and harsh manual labor was the norm. Beatings and filthy living conditions were also common. By 1818, 86% of Indians died in the missions. The Indians of California faced a sudden perilous future. In a mere 50 years, their entire world was flipped upside down. They went from being a prosperous, low-impact, mainly peaceful society to a quickly diminishing people of the past. Europeans' advanced weaponry and materialistic drive threatened their very existence. Soon the Indians began to revolt and escape. Between 1775 and 1824, 5 missions were burned down in 3 separate revolts. During the mid-1800s, guerrilla bands began to raid missions. In total, some 81,000 Indians were escaped. So in 1834, the Mexican governor Jose Figueroa freed the Indians from the mission system. Unfortunately, the native population had already suffered a massive casualty. Their numbers had dropped by nearly a third due to the mission system. Unfortunately, the dwindling Indian population wasn't given their right to land. Instead, the Spanish divided all of California amongst government insiders. Some 26 million acres were split between only 813 ranchers. So we all know the story of Johann Sutter. In 1840, Johann became a Mexican citizen and received a land grant of 48,827 acres, where he eventually found gold. marking the beginning of the California Gold Rush. But what we didn't learn about were the 200 Miwok Indians living on his land. Tour guides at Sutter's Mill will tell you Sutter employed the Indians at his mill. However, quotes directly from two of Sutter's managers say otherwise. In the words of Heinrich Leonhard, "I had to lock the Indian women and men together in a large room to prevent them from returning to their homes in the mountains at night. Large numbers deserted during the daytime." Or as Pearson Reading, another of Sutter's managers, puts it, "The Indians of California make as obedient and humble of slaves as the Negroes in the South. For a mere trifle you can secure their services for life." Stories of Sutter arming Indians from near tribes to steal children from distant villages in order to pay off his debts can be found all over the internet. So that brings us to the next section of history, 1842, the Gold Rush. The events at Sutter's Mill sparked the beginning of the next stage of California, and a whole other struggle for California's shrinking Indian population. In 1840, only 4,000 Europeans lived in California, 400 being Americans. With news of gold in California and the promising call of big bucks, 100,000 settlers suddenly rushed in. This sealed the fate of the indigenous Californians. Next, I will share with you a small clip from YouTube. Short clip, excuse me.
In 1848, after the Mexican-American War, California passed from Mexican to American hands. Soon after, gold was discovered in the north, bringing a rush of miners onto the lands of interior nations who had been out of the reach of coastal missions and Mexican ranches. The majority of tribes are kept in constant fear on account of the indiscriminate and inhuman massacre of their people. They have become alarmed by the increased flood of immigration, much spread over their country. It is just incomprehensible to them. Adam Johnson, Indian Agent.
Oh, my bad. So, as you can tell, the natives were completely overwhelmed. They had no idea what was coming. Much like the massive death rates the Spanish missions brought on, Gold Rush miners and death squad militias were accountable for some 100,000 murders. Militias like Humboldt Home Guard, Eel River Minutemen, and Placer Blades would perform routine attacks on Indians, brutally killing men, women, and children. Some notable massacres from this time period include the Clear Lake, Bridge Gulch, and Wyote massacres. Many of these massacres were unidentified. All too often, entire villages would be completely wiped out and completely forgotten. Captain W.S. Jarboe led a massacre in the county of Mendocino, brutally killing men, women, and children. A story from the Alta California newspaper on the massacre describes the scene. The attacking party rushed upon them, blowing out their brains and splitting their heads open with tomahawks. Little children in baskets, and even babies, had their heads smashed to pieces or cut open. Mothers and infants shared the same phenomenon. Many of the fugitives were chased or shot as they ran. The children, scarcely able to run, toddled towards the squaws for protection, crying with fright, but were overtaken, slaughtered like wild animals and thrown into piles. 1860. Not only did the government ignore Jarboe's crimes against humanity, the state actually approved a $9,347 reward for the militia, and Jarboe received a personal thank you letter from the governor. The mass murder in California had decimated the Indian population. Some 34,000 natives remained by the mid-1860s. As noted in the last slide, the state of California heftily rewarded Jarboe and his militia for their services. Believe it or not, the government was actually much more involved than this. In 1852, $1.1 million was paid to militias. On April 22, 1850, California passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. This allowed any white person to adopt an Indian child with the parents' consent. However, since Indians couldn't testify against a white person in court, white settlers were able to take any Indian child. The California government awarded another $410,000 to local militias. In 1856, the California government paid 25 cents per Indian scalp, $5 per head. In the words of Governor Peter H. Burnett, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. We cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. There was a person up in Humboldt County who was found with a small child, a young Indian child, and they asked him, "What are you doing with this child?" He said, "I am protecting him. He's an orphan." And they say, "Well, how do you know he's an orphan?" He said, "I killed his parents." A quote from Frank Lapina, a professor of Native American Studies at California State University, Sacramento. As mentioned earlier, the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians allowed for any white settler to enslave an Indian child. Boys would sell for around $60, while girls sold for $200. The gold rush proved too much for Indians. The attrition rate, or the rate of shrinkage in size or number, was about 90%. This is comparable to the Armenian genocide. Although the numbers are significantly lower, Nazi Germany only saw the loss of 2/3 of the Jewish population. 9/10 of the native Californians were killed. So it's safe to say they killed members of the group. Survivors of these brutal massacres no doubt faced mental harm. Attacks from local militias, funded by the state government, inflicted life conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Lastly, the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians allowed whites to kidnap children from natives and adopt them. To answer my thesis question, there is no doubt what Californians and the U.S. as a whole committed was genocide. In fact, by percentages, it equates as one of the worst cases of genocide in all history. Thank you for your time. I hope you learned as valuable a lesson as I did. We can't trust our history books.